Thank you, everyone. Bill has limited time with us, so I'm going to leave my preambulars about this panel until after he speaks, because he has to leave at about quarter after. Bill doesn't need a whole lot of introduction, probably, to this crowd. Noted author, environmentalist, writer for The New Yorker, author of probably one of the most important books on the climate crisis, End of Nature, published in 1989 and now translated into 24 languages, and also one of the founders of 350.org, which is probably the largest and more important climate change organization that has helped organize thousands of climate protests and rallies around the world over the last years, and has been instrumental both in stopping the Keystone XL pipeline and launching the fossil fuel divestment movement here in the United States. And so, Bill, thank you very much for taking a little bit of time, and over to you.
Well, I'm so happy to be with you guys virtually. I wish I was there in person. On the other hand, it's a good low-carbon way to connect. I want to so thank people who are working in this fight on the trade pacts. And I think I just want to tell one quick story. And that's the story of this fight over the Keystone Pipeline, which was one of the really grand exercises in democracy in recent American history. It started very small in the summer of 2011. 1,200 and some people went to jail to protest a pipeline that really almost no one had heard of at that point. And that was the largest civil disobedience action about anything in a number of years in this country. And it roused a lot of other people to join in what eventually became the most, I guess the most iconic environmental fight in a long time in this country. It resulted, before it was over, in more emails to the Senate in a single day than there's ever been on any topic, and more public comments than on any project in State Department history. It reached the point as a kind of center of our democracy where Mitt Romney, in his first big ad as Republican candidate for president, said his first action in office would be to approve the Keystone Pipeline. And in fact, he added that he would go dig it himself if he had to, which I thought was a kind of lovely image. But the point is that this was democracy working the way it was supposed to work. Millions of people, animated, in action, coming together around a difficult question, persuading their leaders eventually to do the right thing. Barack Obama in November announced that there would be no Keystone Pipeline. A few days later, TransCanada Company, the foreign company that had backed this thing, the company that had taken by eminent domain against the wishes of thousands of farmers their land across the Midwest, TransCanada, the company that had done its best to suborn our democracy by hiring every kind of lobbyist and official they could think of in D.C., TransCanada announced that it was suing under the grounds of NAFTA to force either the approval of the Keystone Pipeline or alternatively they would take a $10 billion gift from the people of the United States as a sorry present for having had the temerity to exercise their democratic rights. This case, the way that cases are in trade pacts, will be heard by, it'll be heard by three guys no one's ever heard of before, sitting in a room someplace where no one else can go in, and they'll make a decision based on whatever the hell they want to. And if we allow that kind of thing to happen, then there's not much use in having democracies, in having NGOs, in having protest movements, in having all those other things. It's not much use fighting. I mean, look, it's hard enough to fight these damn fights. People had to go to jail. People had to spend years of their lives. It's hard enough to do this stuff and beat big oil every once in a while. If you then have that victory taken away by by some process over which no one has any way of controlling, fighting, doing anything with, then I don't know what the point really is. That means the point for the moment is use the same kind of movements to stop these new trade agreements before they happen, before. One of the lessons we've learned in the fossil fuel world is when you're in a hole, stop digging, okay? And we're already in a hole, in the NAFTA hole, in the GATT hole, and all the other holes, but there's no reason at all to dig our hole down deeper. In fact, it's high time we start scrambling back up. So I think it's a terrifically good sign that people from a variety of areas are coming together, from the labor movement, the environmental movement, the civil rights movement, and the international human rights movement, everybody else coming together to say, no more of this. We'd actually, just in the same way that we'd like a planet with some ice caps and a planet that might have still a coral reef or two, we'd also like a planet that has some citizen democracy in it also, one that isn't entirely ruled by our corporate overlords in ways that we can't even begin to fight. So, so many thanks to everybody who's taking the battle straight on this. I don't think there could be anything much more important that you could be doing.
Bill, would you have time for maybe one or two questions?
Absolutely.
So if someone would like to pose a question for Bill McKibben, the microphones are open. Don't be bashful. Here we go. Just 1 second, Bill. Go ahead.
Hey, Bill, it's Lori Wallach. How are you? I have a campaigning question, which is, first of all, amazing work on everything you've been doing. And there's a totally kick-ass climate movement built from the ground up in the U.S., and you're spot on right that both its power to continue to win and some of its major accomplishments are being put at risk by these so-called trade agreements. And nothing is probably more threatening than the two that are coming down the pike, which would, for instance, make us start exporting LNGs, huge incentive to take more carbon fuels out of the ground, to all those additional countries. 50,000 more corporations that could do the kind of investor state cases that TransCanada is doing. So given that context, what advice do you have for how the education, the empowerment that's needed to help have the trade campaigners understand the existential climate threat to the future of the planet that the agreements are causing as compared to the things they know about really well, their jobs, food safety, access to medicines, and the converse, what's the best way to have the climate campaigners realize that actually a part of their being successful in their goals is necessarily stopping the agreements? Thanks.
Well, Lori, thanks, and thanks for all your work. I think in a certain way the answer in both questions is the one I gave before. TransCanada gave us a real gift. Look, the problem with fighting trade stuff, as you know, is that it's hard to think of a sort of phrase that's much more abstract than multinational trade agreement. It's not the kind of thing that make most people sort of the educational work is enormous to get people to understand it. But tons of people, at least in the climate movement, came to understand why Keystone was absolutely vital. And to understand it wasn't vital just because it stopped this one pipeline. It was vital because, as the head of the American Natural Gas Association said last year, we now face the Keystoneization of every project we're trying to build. I mean, everybody's figured out that they can stand up to big oil, big coal, and big gas. And we're now beating pipelines and coal ports and things at least as often as we're losing. It's been quite a remarkable shift. So I think people understand, if you know, in the context of this Keystone thing, the threat that it represents. That may have been a real present from TransCanada to everybody fighting these trade pacts. And my guess is that their brethren in the corporate community were none too pleased that they'd offered up this example right in the middle of all these fights. So make the use of it, and we'll keep trying to think of other ways to explain why the greatest global crisis that we ever faced is only exacerbated by these kind of global agreements.
Thanks. We'll take one more question.
Okay. Hi, I'm Stephanie Lowe. I work with the Sierra Club. Just as you were telling the story about the TransCanada lawsuit, which, as you say, came at a really wonderful time because it gives us time to see exactly how this is going to affect the climate, the political climate, if it passes. So
I'm having a hard time hearing.
I'm having a hard time talking. Sorry. So, just while you were telling the story, it occurred to me, oh, thank you. It occurred to me that, how about, see what you think about this. 500,000 people right after the elections standing in front of Congress so they cannot have a lame duck session.
It sounds like a reasonable plan to me. The only thing I'll say is, having helped a little bit gather the 400,000 people that came to New York for the big climate march, if you want to do it, you better start planning now, because
that's why I asked.
500,000 people is a hell of a lot of logistical planning to get accomplished. That said, there's probably people out there that will come, because I think more and more people are understanding it. If my neighbor here and friend, Mr. Sanders, proved anything this year, it's that you can get people to turn out in large numbers if you stand for something.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Bill. If you need to drop off, understood. But thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for your good work. Take care.
Great. Well, I'll go back to my brief introductory comments. I'll introduce the speakers. Alana, if you want to come up and join, or actually, if you want to watch Kevin, we'll stay there. So I just wanted to say that Bill didn't talk much about the climate crisis, so maybe I'll just say a word about it. This is the first time I haven't heard Bill start by talking about the climate crisis. So yeah, we live on a planet, as we know, where these vital and fragile balances that have provided us, with a breathtakingly rich and beautiful home are being compromised to a degree that could upend economic, political, and social systems in our lifetimes. And every time the science comes in, it's a decade or two earlier. And if you live in places like Tacloban in the Philippines, it's already upon you. It's here. We continue to treat the planet as a thing where we can dump our effluence and assume an infinite capacity to regenerate. The rules governing trade and investment reflect this attitude, basically. The science tells us that we're moving closer and closer to breaching critical planetary boundaries, not only in climate change, but also species extinction, biodiversity loss, nitrogen cycle, freshwater hydrological cycles, etc. So we really are facing something enormous in this case, which is the anachronism of a 21st century galloping set of environmental crises and 20th century trade and investment rules that just act as if we were on another planet, not this one, nothing less. This is huge. So to explore this little issue, we have Bill, of course, but we also now have with us Kevin Gallagher, Professor of Global Development Policy at Boston University's Frederick Party School of Global Studies, where he directs the Global Economic Governance Initiative. He's written a number of books about Chinese investment, international financial institutions, trade, development, and investment agreements. And he's often, you'll see his writings in The Guardian, Financial Times, and other places. We'll also be joined by Carol Muffett, who is the president and CEO of the Center for International Environmental Law, a nonprofit organization, quote, that uses the power of law to protect the environment, promote human rights, and ensure a just and sustainable society. Before joining CL, Carol was the executive director of the Climate Law and Policy Project, deputy campaigns director at Greenpeace USA, and where he was instrumental in the organization's campaigns on global warming, coal, and other issues. So he's also an adjunct professor at American University and has written a number of books about, or articles around governance, natural resources, and post-conflict peace building. So his work has spanned both the academic as well as the activist world. And finally, we'll be joined by Ilana Solomon, who works with the Sierra Club, has been there since 2012, and she directs the club's work on responsible trade, which works to create public support for trade investment rules that protect the environment, shed light on environmental threats posed by our current global trading system, and ensure that trade rules do not undermine government's ability to protect the climate. So thank you all for joining us, and without any further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Kevin.
Well, welcome. Thank you very much for having me, folks. I'm real sorry that I'm not down there with you. When I was a student, I used to skip classes from boring professors and go to teach-ins all the time, but now I'm a boring professor and I have to teach all morning. I have to say, during Occupy here in Boston, I used to take my classes to Occupy and just teach over there, but I don't have the budget to come down to New York with my whole class. And actually, if I did, I probably would have taken them all to Germany yesterday to protest the TTIP. It's great to be on the panel with Bill, a good friend of mine, and with Carol and Ilana. I'm going to make 5 general points about the U.S. trade agenda, and then 5 specific ones related to how derailed the trade agenda is from the new global consensus on climate change. So first, let me make 5 key points. All right, 1, the United States has explicitly abandoned the World Trade Organization. Right, the World Trade Organization has many problems, and many of us have been campaigning about the problems there to begin with for a long time. But it does have one country is one vote, and the current round of WTO is supposed to be about development and sustainable development in particular, which is part of the reason why the United States has abandoned it. Number 2, the United States, through the TPP, the TTIP, the United States-China Bilateral Investment Treaty, and the U.S.-India Bilateral Investment Treaty, has an explicit strategy to table the very proposals that are dead on arrival at the WTO into these other countries, which, if you add up all these trade treaties, they're more than 75% of the world economy. So the United States is basically rewriting the rules for 75% of the world economy, and those very rules are the same things that we table at the WTO and that are dead on arrival. Number 3, the economic gains of all these treaties, as I'm sure my friend Tim Wise, who talked to you earlier today, talked about, are pretty close to zero. And the United States has reluctantly admitted this in a number of forums, even Jacob Blue. And what they say to us is, yeah, okay, it isn't really about the economic benefits. It's about the United States writing the rules for the world economy, which leads to my 4th point, that that's the big problem, that these rules are fundamentally the wrong rules for a world economy that distributes the economic gains of our economic activity in a socially just, socially inclusive, and environmentally sustainable manner. So point 5, say no to absolutely any treaty that comes down the pike that has this model baked into it. It's not what you expect a professor to say, but it's Friday. So now 5 points specific to that with relation to climate change. 1, it's really important, as Tom started to note, and I'm surprised Bill didn't say because he says it all the time. Number 1 is that there is now a global consensus on climate change, and that's only really become manifest in the past 10 months. There's a global consensus that climate change is a problem and that we all have to act and make it one of the number 1 priorities in the world economic activity and the goals that we're trying to do. We have the United States, China, and I'll credit the Obama administration for this, the U.S.-China treaty last year unlocks a 30-year north-south divide over climate change. The Sustainable Development Goals, just a month after that, baked in climate action as one of the core goals for the whole world economy that hundreds of countries signed on to just a few weeks after that. Obviously, the Paris Agreement that I'm also surprised Bill didn't talk about very much. Countries all over the world, regardless of whether or not they're from north or south, put together a national action plan to make climate change a priority. Just 2 weeks ago, the G20 and all the multilateral development banks also baked it in. Number 2, to Obama's credit, he has actually baked in climate goals into the other Bretton Woods-like institutions, such as the IMF and the multilateral development banks. Okay, the basic consensus is not only that we have to do something about climate change, that doing something means taking two kinds of fundamental actions. Number one, shift away from the bad stuff, right? Shift away from fossil fuels, coal, etc., and two, transition into a clean, carbon-free economy. All right, in the multilateral development banks, to Obama's credit, we are now close to a point where multilateral development banks cannot fund coal, okay? And just last week, the multilateral development banks had a competition of how much of their budgets they're going to allocate towards clean and alternative technologies. The World Bank said 28% of its portfolio is going to be toward clean technologies. And so the Inter-American Development Bank said, well, we'll do 30%. And the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development said, okay, well, we're going to get to 40% by 2020. Well, where's trade policy on this? That's point number three. The trade policy is completely inconsistent with this global consensus, and even completely inconsistent with the Obama administration's leadership in terms of the multilateral development banks. And Ambassador Tubiana said as much last week. If you don't follow climate change as much, the French ambassador Tubiana was really the linchpin and the leader of a lot of the negotiations around the Paris agreements. And she said last week, and this was reported in the trade press, that the trading system needs to be made coherent with the new climate change consistent commitments. And she said, if it doesn't, we'll go nowhere, she said. She also said that the TTIP is a prime example of a real test of the extent to which that we can make these two more compatible. But rather than being compatible, rather than being coherent, as we'll hear from my other panelists, it's actually the exact opposite. The TTIP and the TPP will liberalize fossil fuel trade and investment across 80% or 60% of the world economy, if you add those two treaties together, right? They will also outlaw the ability to accelerate renewable energy and climate resilient policies. And this isn't just theory and reading law. We see this stuff. The United States just used the WTO to pick off India's renewable and clean energy policies. They picked off the Chinese a couple of years ago for creating the most incredible solar power industry that the world has ever seen. As Bill just said, under NAFTA, Lone Pine is trying to pick off the major social victory of the past few years in terms of the pipeline, and TransCanada is trying to do the same thing. And under Germany's treaties, private investors have used ISDS to try to pick off Germany's attempt to shift towards clean industries themselves. All right, so it's not theoretical. The trade regime is completely out of step and out of line with our climate goals and even our leadership on some of these other things. Point number four, that comes at a real economic cost. If you don't care about the climate like all of us do, and all you care about are jobs and economic benefits, well, these treaties are going to strip away the benefits that come with the regulations that we have, that Lone Pine, TransCanada, and the U.S. government are trying to pick off across the world. If you look at the economic studies that Tim was talking about before, the only studies that find that these treaties will be any kind of a net positive find net positives if what are called in trade lingo NTBs, or non-tariff barriers, are eliminated. Well, what private industry calls a non-tariff barrier is what all of us would call a bona fide environmental or social regulation that protects the public welfare and makes markets work more perfectly so that we can get the economic growth and benefits that we need. My colleague Frank Ackerman, who was going to be on this panel with us but couldn't make it today, has done a study that shows the environmental cost of the TTIP in Europe. And he shows that if Europe's pioneering renewable energy policies and pioneering chemicals policies were under attack under ISDS, that those policies are worth about $46 to $110 billion a year. And if those were eliminated, that takes away all of the benefits that come from the very pie-in-the-sky studies that show that there's any benefits there. So point 5 on climate change is the same point 5 that I had in general, it says we have to say absolutely no to any kind of trade treaty that isn't consistent with our climate change goals. As Bill said, as scientists tell us day in and day out, and as people concerned about social justice globally and in the United States tell us every day, is that we have to make climate change an absolute priority. We could have a conversation of what real trade treaties would look like that would incorporate climate change goals. We could liberalize all the clean technology. We could raise tariffs on coal and fossil fuel and ban their ability to be freely moved around through investment treaties. We could eliminate ISDS so that private companies couldn't sue us for doing that. But we're not having that conversation because the very companies that are the ones that are dragging and causing the climate crisis are being handed the governance of these treaties through ISDS. The Washington Post, in addition to that, they're actually sitting on the committees and writing the rules. The Washington Post famous article that shows that there's 566 advisory groups, individuals who are advising United States trade policy. Well, 480 of them are from industry and industry associations. Nerds like me and civil society members are, when we are on these committees, we're parked off into the corner and we get to file what we have to say into a suggestion box. Well, I have a suggestion. No to all these trade until they're more in line with our climate goals. Thank you. Thanks a lot. And I'll stick around and answer questions.
Thanks very much, Kevin. We're going to start the panel with Ilana and Carol here. And hope you can stay around because there will be more Q&A for the three of you after their presentations.
Great. Well, welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for being here with us. Ooh, a warm welcome already. My name, again, is Ilana Solomon, and I direct the Sierra Club's Responsible Trade Program. And I'm going to spend some time today discussing why the Sierra Club, as our nation's oldest and largest grassroots environmental organization, has prioritized trade, and why we are so concerned about the impacts that trade agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership and like the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or TTIP, if I can use one acronym today, threatens our work and our hard-fought victories and challenges ahead. I'm going to start with a little bit of big picture and then get into some details. So to us, the big picture is that the Sierra Club believes that there is a fundamental conflict between our work to fight climate change, to protect our environment and wild places, and our current model of corporate-driven trade. And we know that in order to avoid catastrophic climate impacts, we have to make major changes in our economy. That's going to involve keeping the vast majority of fossil fuels in the ground, and that means stopping fossil fuel infrastructure projects like the Keystone Pipeline. It means stopping fracking, offshore drilling, and other production of fossil fuels. We're also working not just to stop the use of fossil fuels domestically, but also their export at the same time while we have to ramp up the transfer of clean technology, especially to countries in the global south. We're also working, of course, to ramp up to 100% clean energy here in the United States, which is going to involve strong government action. It's going to mean mandates and subsidies, tax credits, boosting US manufacturing. We're also going to need to be consuming less, and what we do consume, producing closer to home. And all of that, really all of that, is going to be undermined by our current corporate-driven model of trade, and again, specifically by agreements like the TPP and TTIP. So that's the bad news. The good news is that I feel that we are an incredibly important historic moment in this campaign, and that if we continue to ramp up our education, our mobilization, I actually really do believe that we have built power, if we continue to build it, that we can defeat these agreements and open up space for the type of economy and the type of trade model that we want to build that would support our climate, environmental, and other public interest goals. So I know other colleagues have talked about this, but I want to, and I know that there's some new colleagues that walked in the room. So to start getting into the substance, I'm actually really going to focus a little bit more, again, on these investor protections or the investor rights that are enshrined in trade agreements, including TPP and TTIP. And from Sierra Club's perspective, this is one of the most dangerous parts of our current model of trade. And you've heard a little bit about this today, but just to summarize again, in trade agreements, often give corporations, foreign investors, foreign corporations, incredibly broad rights. The right to fair treatment, the right to a minimum standard of treatment that are as broad as that sounds. And then they empower those foreign investors to directly, essentially sue governments, not in domestic courts, but run around domestic courts in private trade tribunals over laws and policies that those foreign investors allege violate one of those NAFTA given rights or the given rights in one of these trade agreements. Now, there's a reason that the Sierra Club as an organization fighting climate change is so concerned about these rights, and that's because the cases are surging, as you can see on this chart. There's now more than 700 cases filed by corporations including Chevron, ExxonMobil, Occidental Petroleum, and many others. And while all public policies are at risk, environmental policies have tended to be most at risk. And for example, half of these new investor state dispute settlement challenges in 2014 specifically stemmed from investments in power generation, in mining, and in oil and gas extraction. Law firms that specialize in investor state are now openly encouraging their corporate clients to use the system as a tool of pressure against further government action in the green sector. And that was a quote. And Chevron has recently stated that the mere existence of this system is important because it acts as a deterrent to policies such as restrictions on fracking. Now, this can sound, again, distant and hypothetical, even though there are more than these 700 cases, but this threat became very, very real, very close, and very personal, again, earlier this year. And I won't say a lot about this because Bill has already talked about it, but as you know, Sierra Club and so many of our allies and indigenous leaders and farmers and ranchers and organizations and activists spent years fighting the dangerous Keystone XL pipeline, and after years of hard work, in November 2016, the Obama administration finally listened and rejected this pipeline. It was an incredible victory, only to have TransCanada again come in 2 months later to file its notice of intent to use NAFTA's investor state rules to challenge the rejection of that pipeline, asking US taxpayers to pay $15 billion. That's more than $100 for each individual US tax filer to TransCanada as compensation for the pipeline. Now, that, unfortunately, actually, let me say about that, it is not just a challenge to that one pipeline that we find concerning, although certainly that is concerning. It is the signal that that case sends to the US government and to other governments that are thinking about putting in place similar policies or rejection of pipelines, that they might think twice about doing that because they don't want to have to go through these long, risky, expensive investor state cases. But that is really the tip of the iceberg of what we would see if TPP and if TTIP were to go into force. The TPP would newly empower more than 9,000 foreign firms for the first time ever with operations in the United States to follow TransCanada's lead and challenge US policies in these private trade tribunals. That would double the number of firms overnight, essentially, that would be able to use this system against the United States. That's TPP alone. And of course, it's not just US policies that are at risk. The TPP would also empower more than 19,000 US firms with operations in other TPP countries to challenge their laws and policies. TTIP is even scarier, actually. TTIP would newly empower more than 24,000 EU firms with operations in the United States to bring investor state cases for the first time ever, and actually more than 50,000 US firms with operations in the European Union. So imagine these dots on the map are all the new investments, and think about the Paris Agreement that we've been talking a little bit about today, and when all of these countries, from TPP countries, from the US and the European Union, try to put in place the policies needed to implement their targets in the Paris Agreement. What are the likes of Chevron and ExxonMobil and Peabody, Shell and BP going to think about that? It's a big putting new roadblocks in the way when we need to be clearing the path. So the Sierra Club actually recently did some original research. We wanted to dig in a little bit more to this number of 9,000 firms in the United States for the first time ever that could challenge US policies, 24,000 in TTIP, and we wanted to see what are the real risks actually to our climate policies and specifically to policies to keep fossil fuels in the ground. Maybe none of them have investments in fossil fuel infrastructure. So we dug in and we released a report recently called Climate Roadblocks, and what we found was actually really shocking and disturbing even to us. What we found is that TPP and TTIP would more than double the number of fossil fuel firms that could follow TransCanada's example and challenge US climate policies in private trade tribunals, and that would empower about 1,000 foreign fossil fuel firms to challenge our government climate policies. And it's not just that 1,000 number that's frightening, it's the types of fossil fuel firms. 45 of the world's 50 biggest polluters would be empowered by these agreements to challenge our policies. We dug in one layer deeper and we said, well, where are they? What are they doing? What policies are they going to threaten? And we looked at 4 areas. The first was fracking. Of course, communities and environmental organizations like the Sierra Club are pushing to ban the dangerous practice of fracking for oil and gas in places across the United States, from California to Pennsylvania to Colorado. The TPP and TTIP would empower corporations that are currently fracking for oil and gas in these 3 states and 9 others to challenge potential successes in stopping fracking in those places. It would more than double the number of fracking firms that can challenge restrictions on fracking, and it would grant these rights to BHP Billiton, which is the largest foreign investor in US shale, to give you a sense of how big that is. In terms of offshore drilling, we looked again, and we thought to avoid a repeat of BP's disastrous 2010 oil spill and Shell's ill-fated attempts to drill in the Arctic, coastal communities, activists, organizations, including the Sierra Club, have been calling for a halt to all new offshore drilling and a cancellation of existing drilling leases. And yet, the TPP and TTIP would newly empower oil and gas corporations with more than 10 million acres worth of offshore drilling leases. That includes BP and Shell, to use investor state to threaten to slow or halt momentum against offshore drilling. In the Arctic, the risks are particularly stark. TTIP alone would empower oil and gas firms that control 85% of leased area in the Arctic to challenge new restrictions on Arctic drilling, as we've seen an amazing movement emerge. And the story continues on to stop drilling for oil and gas on public lands. There's a major movement afloat in the United States, and yet the agreements would empower corporations that own drilling leases on over 720,000 acres of US public lands to challenge restrictions on drilling. And on pipelines, the agreements would empower and give new investor state rights to corporations that own tens of miles worth of pipelines across 29 states. So the risks are real. They are concrete. We have a map that shows exactly what the risks are in these 4 areas. And they present a real threat and a challenge to groups that are fighting these projects. I want to say a little bit about another issue that Kevin also mentioned, and this is how the TPP and TTIP would also expand trade in fossil fuels. And I'm going to talk specifically briefly about liquefied natural gas exports. So right now in the United States, in order to approve any exports of fracked gas, there at least is a process in the United States for our US Department of Energy that is required to undertake a study to examine the environmental and the economic impacts associated with exporting natural gas. The TPP and TTIP would instead just require our US Department of Energy to automatically deem those exports in the public interest, no analysis, and exports would be automatically granted to all countries in the agreement, a total run-around democratic process. And that has significant consequences. Liquefied natural gas exports are extremely energy intensive by the time you extract the gas, pipe it to the terminals, cool it, liquefy it, and transport it to be burned elsewhere. It locks us into more fossil fuel infrastructure and climate disrupting emissions. I want to say a little, I just included this. Usually I start with this slide. I wasn't sure how much time I would have to talk about it, but I'm going to say 30 seconds about it. And a lot of people have talked about the USTR, the US Trade Representatives Advisory System, about 600 advisors, 85% of them are corporate industry advisors. If there was any sort of doubt in your mind about how did these rules come to be so favorable towards fossil fuel firms in these agreements, this is a screenshot of the Energy Advisory Committee to the US Trade Representative. And I think it's instructive because you will notice that my colleagues at CL or the Sierra Club or 350 that I know is in the room are not on this list. And instead you have, I don't know why there's arrows actually next to any of them because all of them are basically the same, Halliburton, Chevron, Nuclear Energy Institute, some of the biggest fossil fuel firms and actors in the world. So it's no surprise about how our trade agreements serve to benefit the interests of big polluters when this is the advisory committee that's creating these rules. The good news is that we, again, like I said in the beginning, are this incredible moment where there has been public opposition building now for years, and we have more work to do. But it does feel like if we can continue to build our power, a big piece of this is education work. We are now at a point where I think more people than ever before know about this agreement, but there's still about half of the US public that's never heard about it, polling shows, because of the great secrecy under which these negotiations were taking place. Though among the Sierra Club's work on trade, just to give you a sense, one is to build a really strong environmental coalition against these harmful trade agreements. We speak more powerfully when we speak together, and we have such a broad range now of environmental justice organizations, from Indigenous Environmental Network to the Natural Resources Defense Council, to other grassroots and bigger green organizations. And keeping that coalition together, I think, is incredibly important. Education, like I said, of our members, Sierra Club's 2.4 million members and supporters, has been critical. We have PowerPoints if you're interested in giving presentations and materials and talking points. We're trying to get the word out as much as possible. But of course, we're not just educating to educate, we're educating to activate. We've been working with our volunteer leaders, one of whom is in the House, Stephanie Lowe, who asked a question, who's been going incredible organizing in New York since I think you learned about the TPP on a fractivist call 4 years ago. So writing letters to the editor, hosting rallies, engaging, through calling days to members of Congress and petitions, and we've been able to mobilize hundreds of thousands of our members through this work. So I will leave it at that and look forward to your questions and comments.
I'm Carol Muffett with the Center for International Environmental Law. As Tom mentioned, CL is a smallish organization with a very modest mandate to protect the environment, promote human rights, and ensure a just and sustainable society. So how do we do that? Well, we use the power of law to do things like protect children and families from toxic risks. We work with forests and forest communities to protect them from illegal logging and palm oil and soy. We work to protect the lives and livelihoods of communities who are confronted with mining impacts in their towns. And we work to confront the threat of global climate change, both here in the United States and in countries around the world. And at every turn, in every area where we work, we are confronted with the challenge of agreements like TTIP and TPP and the trade agreements that came before them. They are one of the most fundamental challenges to achieving our mission. As you've heard today, TTIP is not a trade agreement in any traditional sense of the term. It's an anti-regulatory treaty. Tariffs, which are the traditional domain of trade agreements, are vanishingly small between the US and Europe. They have been for ages. In many cases, they don't exist. So 80% of the ostensible benefit of TTIP is coming from lowering regulatory barriers to trade. And disproportionately, those rules are environmental rules, their health and safety rules, and their labor rules. I have a lot to say about TTIP and its threats to the environment, but Tom has asked me to focus on chemicals because you haven't heard about chemicals yet, so I'm going to do that. I want to focus on the risks that TTIP poses to chemical safety and our ability to confront chemical threats. More than 80,000 chemicals are known to be in commerce in the United States. In Europe, that number is 140,000. That doesn't mean that Europe has more chemicals in commerce than we do. It's a sign of just how little we know about what is out there. Of these hundreds of thousands of chemicals, many have been detected in our environment, in our bodies, in the bodies of our children. And yet the vast majority have never been assessed for toxic impacts, let alone regulated. Over the past decade, Europe has made modest but very important progress in closing these gaps and starting to address chemical risks through a comprehensive chemical regulation that's commonly known as REACH. The US has not. The most important chemical legislation at the federal level in the US, the Toxic Substances Control Act, has not been updated in 40 years. And almost no new chemicals have been added to hazardous lists in that time. Is it because we don't think there are new risks? No. It's because industry has been profoundly effective at using regulatory delay, litigation, scientific uncertainty to delay action and to delay progress, and even to delay the assessment of chemical risks. As a result, the burden of addressing chemical safety has fallen largely to the states in the US. It's the state level where regulators have been responding to chemical risks by addressing toxics in children's toys, requiring labeling of products, keeping products off the shelves. In fact, 35 states have assumed primary responsibility for protecting human health and the environment from chemical risks. New York, for example, has refused to register numerous products that are registered by the EPA on the grounds that those products don't deserve to be legally distributed, legally offered for sale or used in New York State. New York is also one of the only entities at either the state or the federal level to actually review final product labeling on containers before it hits the shelves. And often what they have found is that the labels that are submitted to EPA or to other regulatory agencies differ from what actually appears on the container. New York's not alone. To understand the massive die-offs in bee colonies both here and around the world, California and Vermont are requiring regulators to reevaluate neonicotinoid pesticides for their impacts on human health and on bees and other pollinators. And in 2015 alone, 13 bills in 8 states looked to prioritize chemicals of concern. Many of these laws, ironically, actually rely on the leadership, on the model that's being set by the Europeans with the REACH legislation. And TTIP poses a fundamental challenge to regulatory progress on both sides of the Atlantic. Chemical and industry groups, chemical companies, pharmaceutical companies, pesticide groups, in both the US and Europe, have made environmental, health, and safety regulations affecting chemicals a major focus of the negotiations. And the trade negotiators themselves have listened. To understand why, you only need to think back to the slide that Alana showed or the graph from Washington Post that you saw this morning. And let me say, neither that slide nor the graph from the Washington Post tells the full story. The trade industry advisory committees, the industries, have dedicated committees to individual industries. There is a trade and environment policy advisory committee with 15 people on it. 7 of those people are from environmental or animal welfare NGOs. 5 are from industry groups. The others are from think tanks, some of which are themselves conservative think tanks. So at least here, in that committee, we have balance. So what does this mean for the negotiations themselves? In Europe, the target is REACH itself and its implementation, particularly with respect to moving REACH forward on new threats such as endocrine disruptors and nanotechnologies, which to date remain largely unaddressed. Here in the United States, the target is not only federal level regulation, but that state level regulation that is actually where we're making progress. Proposals put forward by the chemical industry and that we have found that have actually been adapted and adopted by the EU and tabled as negotiating positions in the TTIP negotiations. These proposals would create an overarching regulatory oversight body designed to minimize regulatory divergence between the EU and the US. It would apply new procedural and substantive requirements to almost all federal and state level regulation, including, and this is really important, the need for a new and completely ill-defined trade impact analysis at both the federal and the state level that has been demonstrated already to be slowing down progress by years on chemical risks in Europe. And it would potentially subject states to international arbitration challenges for exercising their authority to protect people and the environment. The impact of the EU proposal will extend beyond encouraging good governance and voluntary transatlantic cooperation. It'll impose multiple procedural mandates, from an early warning system to regulatory challenges to the trade and cost-benefit impact assessments. The result of this is going to be profound regulatory chill. I've worked with regulators at the national level and at the international level who have said bluntly that they are not pursuing a specific course of action because of the risk of running afoul of trade mandates. These are regulators who are supported by national level state departments, trade authorities, justice departments. Connecticut doesn't have that. Delaware doesn't have that. New Hampshire doesn't have that. The prospect of interjecting international trade processes, international trade debates, and foreign governments into regulation at the state level would have a profound chilling effect on regulation across the board. Chemicals are only an example of that. If you're wondering how our own government has responded to the European proposal, or what it in turn has proposed to the Europeans, I'm wondering that too. We've never seen it. The scope of any U.S. regulatory proposal on TTIP is unknown because the U.S. refuses to publicly release any text. And U.S. has yet to publicly address the details of the EU text or similar industry-drafted proposals. It's telling that the most recent fact sheet on TTIP to be posted to USTR's website, you can go and look, is on transparency in TTIP. It's from January 2015. Presumably a lot has happened since then. This is emblematic of the lack of transparency and the fundamentally undemocratic nature of these negotiations and of our current trade system in general. It's also emblematic of the challenge in responding meaningfully to negotiating text, to negotiating positions, when we don't know what the text is or even if it exists. What we do know is that the proposals being put forth by this industry and being picked up by negotiators pose real and serious risks to human health and environmental safety. Industry proposals on pesticides would increase the amount of pesticide residue on food sold to consumers, allow the use of carcinogens, endocrine disruptors, and other toxic pesticides, interfere with efforts to protect bees and other pollinators, to safeguard food supplies for future generations, weaken laws to permit the use of carcinogens and other substances of very high concern as pesticides that would pose a risk not only to the public, but to workers, consumers, and communities. And they're working to block access to vital information that is needed to develop non-toxic alternatives to toxic chemicals. And most fundamentally, they're working to interfere with the democratic process by usurping the regulatory authority of US states and EU member states and pushing regulatory discussions into processes that the public itself cannot access. This is only one among many environmental threats that TTIP poses, and I'll be happy to discuss others. Thanks.
Thank you very much to all the presenters. Kevin, can you still hear us?
Yep, 100%.
Great. We've got another 30 minutes for questions and answers. Love to have you hang around. The mics are open.
Hi, how are you? This is incredible. I came to this topic from the access to medicine area, and it's just opening up an incredible can of worms, and it makes me wonder, I mean, it almost feels like recklessness on the part of our government, so I'm kind of wondering what kind of remedies are going to happen if, I'm hearing if it's not this TPP or TTIP, it'll be another version, so what kind of remedies are we looking at down the road if something is passed? I mean, I just think you can't undo these treaties afterwards if there's damages, so where do you head?
Yeah, we've heard a lot today about investors and companies who believe that their profits would be negatively affected by environmental regulation using provisions of the various trade pacts to either overturn those regulations or demand compensation. I was wondering whether any jiu-jitsu would be possible in this area because there are investors and large corporations who are going to be slammed by climate change. Insurance companies come to mind because they have billions of liabilities at stake. Is there any possibility of cooperating with a large insurance company, for instance, to use these same provisions of trade pacts to demand compensation if governments fail to take action to prevent climate change, or if governments, under pressure from other decisions by the trade courts, overturn regulations which were designed to prevent climate change, and by doing so injure the profits of the investors of the companies who are going to be hurt by climate change? Thank you.
May I jump in, Tom?
Yeah, Kevin, I think we'll gather one more question and then we'll jump in, okay?
Oh, okay, sure.
We'll let you go first. So one more question from over here and then we'll go.
Okay, my question, my understanding was that if we can stop TPP, it will chill TTIP. Am I correct or wrong?
Okay,
May I ask a question? Because
okay,
I
one
haven't
more,
had
sure.
an opportunity. Yeah, I'm just wondering, when we talk about the science and the policy on regulating toxic chemicals, one of the shortfalls we have in that area is a lack of science because of the the whole TISCA freezing on all of that. These things have not been properly assessed and studied. And the second part of that is, we may in some cases know the individual, the health impact of a given carcinogen or chemical, but we don't know the cumulative impacts because they have not really been fully studied. What effect would these trade deals have on science, on scientific research going forward to fill in these gaps?
Well, let me just hold there. We'll go ahead and take that first group of four. And Kevin, why don't you go ahead and then we'll have Ilana and Carol address the questions.
Yeah, well, my simple answer to the first question is that the first priority is to stop the TPP, the TTIP, and the United States-China bilateral investment treaty, right? If we can create a coalition around that, then we have sent the signal that we just are not going to take the model anymore. But as the questioner, and I'm sorry I can't see you, but as you noted, we actually have a bigger problem, which is that the World Trade Organization, NAFTA, and over 1,000 bilateral investment treaties already bake in this model. But if we stop these, then we've got a conversation, and then we need a thorough review of past trade policy. And we've got to have, from a climate change perspective, we got to make sure that all of our trade treaties reward transitions to low carbon inclusive development and sequester and stop high carbon, fossil fuel intensive, and climate unresilient practices. In terms of the science, one of the core issues is that in Europe, there's what scientists refer to as the precautionary principle that's baked right into European environmental law, which says that we don't know so much of the science, and we don't know what the new technologies and new chemicals that companies are coming out with every single day. We don't know what their impact's in, so we're going to be precautious about these. U.S. firms hate that. They've been able to derail U.S. policies towards that. That's a fundamental area of deharmonization between the United States and Europe. And if the TTIP looks like NAFTA, or if the TTIP looks like the TPP, it'll be very difficult to exercise precaution for chemicals policy and science policy in general.
Thanks, Kevin.
Say a few words and then pass it to Carol. And in terms of the jujitsu question, it's a good one and it comes up often. I guess I'd have two thoughts on that. One is that the system is definitely stacked to big profitable industries. These cases are incredibly costly to put on, and it also takes about $8 million per case to defend. So by the nature of the cases, they're definitely, again, sort of geared towards the big industry actors. And then I think there might be, an unusual case in which an actor could use the system sort of against itself, but I think that would be the outlier, and I think the risk still of creating a system that's a one-way street for foreign investors and corporations to challenge government policies wouldn't be sort of worth the risk, is our take. In terms of the question on if we stop TPP, will it kill TTIP? I would say that it would certainly make TTIP a lot harder, but I would not want to stop being vigilant and stop working towards it. And the same thing goes that if we don't manage to kill the TPP, which I think we can, we also have to keep working. That doesn't mean that TTIP is automatically going to come into force, that we still will work to fight that agreement, to stop the negotiations, potentially even from ever concluding. So either way, I think we have to be prepared for the different scenarios, but certainly stopping the TPP would have an impact on the future agreements.
The difficulty in doing that jujitsu is sort of emblematic in the problems with the system, and I want to give you two very quick examples. One of the things that is often used to advertise trade agreements to the public is the addition of environment chapters, which are typically tacked on at the end, and which I typically compare to the hood ornaments on a car. It may look pretty, but it doesn't do a lot. In truth, there are often provisions in environment chapters from NAFTA forward that would allow governments to hold each other accountable for violating their environmental responsibilities under the trade agreement. They've never been used once in 20 years across multiple trade agreements, not once. We, CL, worked with Environmental Investigation Agency to put together a dossier, an investigation under the U.S.-Peru Free Trade Agreement, which was supposed to be a model, a first of its kind in having what could be an enforceable provision attached to its environment chapter. We documented extensive illegality in the Peruvian logging industry using the Peruvian government's own documents, its own criminal enforcement documents. We delivered it, a 79-page document to USTR, including both the raw data and the legal analysis of how it violated Peruvian law, how it violated international law, how it violated U.S. law, and how it violated this free trade agreement. USTR sat on the information for months. About 10 months after we submitted, they came back and said, well, we had a conversation with Peru, and we adopted a 5-point action plan, and basically they promised that it's not going to happen again. In 2015, we did another analysis and found that 94% of the logging of the timber coming into the U.S. out of Peru was illegal. 94%. The problem is that these agreements are managed. They're under the authority of agencies whose mission is to promote trade and only trade. There is an utter lack of political will to go beyond that. In an ideal world, you could actually use trade agreements for positive ends, to reduce fossil fuel subsidies, to promote green trade. And yet, countries have had an opportunity to do that again and again, and they failed to do so. Just quickly on the science and on the liability question. On the science, the best way to address that scientific gap would be to stop treating information about what kills people as confidential business information. Industries on both sides of the Atlantic have actually been selective in what information they share, what research they share about the toxicity of their chemicals, not only with the public, but between different government agencies. What the Consumer Product Safety Commission gets may be completely different than what EPA gets. What the Australian authorities get is different again. And nobody but the companies themselves has all of the science, so we don't actually know what science is out there. On the question of ultimate liability for this and undoing this wrong, I agree with Kevin and Ilana that the best solution is prevention. But I also think that we are constantly working for new ways to go at this system. One that is currently underway is the development of a new treaty on the human rights obligations of multinational conventions and the obligations of countries to hold their own companies accountable for human rights violations. That may be one route to taking this on.
Thank you very much. More questions?
I have here the information. There was a 2010 United Nations report saying that all the greenhouse emissions combined by the transportation are responsible only for the 13%, when the animal agriculture and livestock is responsible for the 51% of all the greenhouse emissions. So basically my point would be why, when the main point is basically related to the consumption of meat, nobody's really talking about that. And we keep talking about the companies, oil, Exxon, British Petroleum, but we're not talking about the main point. And also, that would be an individual thing that we could do right now. I mean, we cannot control what the corporations are doing, but we can control what we are doing individually. And that would reduce the 51%. Okay?
Great, excellent question. Are there any other questions? Shall we gather a couple more? All right, well, let's take this one. And Kevin, I would like to use this as an opportunity to invite from you some of the research that I know you've been looking at with regard to embedded carbon in global trade and how that shakes out both quantitatively but also where we stand in terms of recognizing that and folding it in somehow to global trade rules. And maybe starting by telling us what embedded carbon is.
Sure, thanks, Tom. I wish I was technologically savvy enough to use my Skype to be able to show you folks a slide, because a picture tells more than 1,000 words from an absent-minded professor. The embedded carbon just means if I buy a toothbrush while I'm brushing my teeth, I'm not emitting any carbon dioxide, but boy, was there a heck of a lot of carbon dioxide that went into the atmosphere to produce the brush and transport it, likely from China to me here in Boston to brush my teeth. And climate scientists have done a lot of research on the embedded carbon of global product flows. And the first thing I should say is that everyone should understand that if you take global GDP, right, all of the global output in a year, over 50% of it is traded, right? So almost more than half of everything that you produce or consume in a country comes from somewhere else. Now, climate scientists have said, oh gosh, well, Gallagher isn't emitting any carbon dioxide by brushing his teeth, but what's the carbon embedded in that toothbrush? And if global trade is responsible for about 28% of global emissions through that kind of a calculation. Now, what I wish I could show you on a map, so a third of the global emissions are due to global trade at minimum. What I wish I could show you on a map is that if you look at the distribution of those flows, almost all the production-related carbon dioxide emissions and all the, so that's the Chinese company that is producing the carbon dioxide, producing the toothbrush that gets its energy from a dirty coal plant in China, right? That's part of the production-related emissions that come from the Gallagher brushing his teeth. But the ships, which are unregulated under the United Nations framework on climate change and under the climate change treaties, the international shipping industry is not, which is filthy industry that uses ballast fuel, really dirty fuels in the shipping. So plus all the transportation, et cetera, to get to me in my house when I brush my teeth, all that adds up to the embodied emissions. And if you look at the global flows of that, most of the production-related emissions and most of the consumption-related emissions are in China, India, the United States, Europe, and Japan. Well, what is that map? That map is the TTIP, the TPP, the U.S.-China bilateral investment treaty, and the U.S.-India bilateral investment treaty. So we are rewriting the rules of the epicenter of carbon dioxide-related trade emissions. All right. That needs to be articulated to climate scientists. That needs to be articulated to climate activists. That needs to be articulated to the finance ministries and environmental ministries and development ministries that have been spending the past 4 years around the world to sign the U.S.-China agreement, to bake in the Sustainable Development Goals, and to obviously put together these big plans under the United Nations Paris Agreement. That the investor-state dispute components of these trade treaties and the coverage of them will undoubtedly give private firms the very tools to unravel the amount of policies that we have to try to combat climate change right now. Now, if we just have a business as usual approach, the world's going to be if every one of these treaties, if every one of the commitments under the Paris Treaty is put in place, that means if every country actually implements them, we're going to be at 2.7 degrees Celsius warmer, okay? We need to get somewhere in between 1.5 and 2. So to get between 1.5 and 2, we not only have to make commitments, but we have to fundamentally change the policy environment towards more low-carbon economic activity. That means aggressively subsidizing renewable energy alternatives. That means aggressively shutting down fossil fuel-intensive plants. Those two things in Geneva, at the WTO tribunals, and those two things in the secret tribunals at the World Bank that govern investor-state dispute resolutions are absolutely in violation of the fundamental principles of the treaties. So these treaties, one, I'll sum up. I'm sorry, gets me excited and very concerned. 28% of all emissions come from trade, and all of that's from the countries that we are currently snapping this unsustainable model on right now. We have to stop these treaties, and we have to have a conversation about a new model.
Carol, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, and I absolutely agree with the question that cows are a source of methane, and and reducing your meat consumption is a useful thing to do if you can do it. But I do want to take issue with the underlying assumption, which I believe is a myth, the myth that everybody is responsible, and because everybody is responsible, nobody is responsible. The architects, the corporations most responsible for environmental harms, including particularly the harm of global climate change, have benefited from that myth for a very long time. It is absolutely true. There's no doubt that each of us, in little things that we do or in big things that we do, we contribute to climate change, we contribute to pollution, we contribute to the consumption of natural resources, beyond a doubt. But think back to the presentations that you've seen today. Think back to the underlying themes and ask yourself, did I have the same control over the choices I made as the companies that influenced this trade regime? Did I have the same access to information? Did I have the same ability to shape the system? Now ask yourself, what about somebody with even less information, even fewer resources than I have? Can she decide when to turn on our lights and where the electricity comes from? Does she know what chemicals are in her products and what to serve her kids? No. We are not in a system where everyone is making informed choices on an equal basis. And until we're in that system, the idea that everybody is equally responsible for the state that we're in is a pervasive and destructive myth.
We have time for maybe just a few more questions.
No one has raised the issue of nuclear power, how it relates to this, the extraction of material, the use of material, the obvious connection of nuclear power to nuclear weapons, the use of the spent material in so-called conventional weapons and the like. We have a prioritization of a global economy based on our so-called Anglo-Saxon model. Yet we, for national interests, specifically protect this industry. It does not operate in anything resembling a free market, a market at all. We have the Price-Anderson Nuclear Power Indemnification Act in the United States, simply because the insurance industry is not stupid enough to insure a single nuclear power plant, and we have similar elsewhere in the world. And you have the British government subsidizing French power. Well, I'm saying this is not being discussed. There is even a carbon dimension, because I believe it's carbon-12 is highly radioactive, which is an off-product of nuclear power. So is this an opportunity to be able to flip the question of this garbage of the most ultimate PC is the market is the answer to everything, when the market is not the answer to everything?
Yeah, you want to go to that side, or?
No, go ahead.
Okay, okay.
We'll get both.
Okay, so I have two questions. So the first one is, it came up at a trade conference I was at 2 weeks ago. The concept of why is it in the United States that when you buy a product, you, the consumer, are responsible for the packaging that product came in, and you have to figure out if you can recycle it and whether you have local recycling and all of those things. And is there a way to either, A, use a trade agreement to change that so that the producers are responsible for the total cost of the life cycle of the product, including the recycling? And if you didn't do it through a trade agreement and a country just did it unilaterally, what do you think would happen because of the trade agreement to that law? And then secondly, just an overlap between some labor and environmental issues. We talked a lot about China, and though a lot of what China is doing is driven by the multinationals, China also does some subsidizing and some oversupply, and we're having a big problem with steel right now. And not only is U.S. steel a good source of middle-class jobs and high-quality steel, it's some of the cleanest steel that's being made. And if the U.S. steel industry dies out and we're only using Chinese steel, that's some of the dirtiest steel being made. And have environmental advocates thought about that issue or gotten involved in that issue at all? Thanks.
Hi, thanks. I wanted to test out, I guess, a sort of an observation or theory that I've seen as a follower of intellectual property rights. Seems that in the UN talks, and I just floated this at lunch, so you've heard this question. In the UN talks, IP was taken off the table, intellectual property rights, patents on environmental technologies a couple of years ago by the developed countries. Developing countries wanted it in there because they were concerned about patents increasing the price of environmental technologies they were going to need and not be able to afford. And then I observed that in the US and EU, at the US Patent and Trademark Office and the European Patent Office, they developed these programs that expedited green patenting. And so they looked really good, you know, sort of they're environmentally friendly, bring on in your green patent and you can come in the side door and get it faster and get ahead of the line. But it occurred to me that what they're kind of doing is stockpiling every imaginable invention they can think of in their own patent offices. And then they're going to come back to the UN table and say, okay, guys, we're ready to talk. And let's talk about licensing all of these ideas that we have. So I don't know if anybody has heard anything like that or has any substantiation for it.
So do you want to take Celeste's question?
I can start by addressing a little bit on nuclear and then part of Celeste's question, and I'll leave the others to my other colleagues. Just a couple of connections. First to nuclear energy. I did note on the last slide, or one of my last slides, that the Nuclear Energy Institute is one of the cleared advisors, and there certainly are a number of benefits to the industry in the pacts. One, I'll just relate back to the investor-state dispute settlement system again, and note that actually one of the sort of iconic environmental challenges is with a Swedish energy firm, Vattenfall, challenging Germany's nuclear energy phase-out. And this was a case that Germany, after Japan's Fukushima nuclear disaster, decided, after also great public engagement and public pressure, to phase out nuclear energy and to make a commitment to ramping up clean, renewable energy, including solar and wind, in its stead. Swedish energy firm Vattenfall decided that was a violation of its investor protections and investor rights in an EU investment treaty called the EU Energy Charter Treaty, and is suing Germany for about $7 billion for the phase out of nuclear energy. I'd also note that there's a lot of talk in the positive sort of trade space about how trade rules can contribute to climate action, about the sort of liberalization of tariffs on green goods. And that seems to be the sort of like panacea about how to do trade in an environmental friendly way, which I actually think there's some problems with the premise that I won't go into now. But one thing I would note is that among the list of items to have tariff reduction on, the WTO has an agreement now. It's an agreement between a set of WTO countries, actually not all WTO countries, to reduce or eliminate tariffs on a set of supposed green goods. And among the green goods include nuclear reactors and a whole bunch of wood pellets and a whole bunch of other really dirty items. So the nuclear energy industry certainly stands to benefit. So Celeste's question, the part of the question on U.S. steel, and also there's been cases around Chinese solar panels, and as you know, this has been a really interesting one in the environmental community, and I think it cuts to the core of the issue about, are we just trying to install the cheapest types of renewable energy, which might be solar panels or wind turbines, steel from wind turbines that we import from overseas? Or are we trying to balance that with boosting domestic manufacturing in places like the United States, which may be slightly more expensive in the short term, but leads to other, we would argue, really important economic gains? And the Sierra Club comes down sort of in the middle and says, yes, of course we need to be reducing the price of renewable energy, and probably some of that is going to come from imports. But we have to be protecting and growing U.S. manufacturing and U.S. steel and the U.S. production of solar panels. And if that means a slight increase in the short term in order to protect and boost up these industries, we find that actually a really important goal. But it's an interesting tension that the environmental community has been grappling with, and I won't say has come to consensus on yet.
Thanks. I'll speak just a little bit about the question of toxics and end-of-life products and what to do about that. Ironically, this is one of the areas where some U.S. states are actually making progress in beginning to require producers to not only to label mercury and other heavy metals in products, but also require them to take responsibility for the disposal of those products at the end of life. In doing this, they're following a leadership where, again, some countries in Europe have been real leaders in doing this. The U.S. not so much. CL and other organizations have been working at the international level to get broader international standards on this, either through the Basel Convention on transport of toxic wastes, or through the strategic approach to international chemicals management. Here we've managed to get end-of-life e-waste prioritized as an issue for collaboration, but countries remain very reluctant to take on binding obligations for it. And I think I'll just use that to pivot to the issues that Alana was addressing, and then I know Tom will speak to. One of the first most positive ways that we could use trade rules to promote green technologies is to stop bringing trade disputes against green technologies, whether it's solar panels solar production in China, or wind farms, or Ontario's feed-in tariffs, or EU complaints about US renewable fuel standards, or US complaints about EU's renewable fuel standards. Trade negotiators talk a good game when they're selling an agreement, but when push comes to shove, they tend to favor profit.
Actually, Kevin, are you there?
May I step in? I mean,
we're going to give you the last word. Why don't you take a minute?
To hear you, Celeste. I can't see you, but we have to remember that this whole teach-in today, all these things should be seen as a cumulative set of reasons to be concerned about this fundamental model. And we're just talking about the environment here, but we shouldn't be separating any of this. This is a fundamentally flawed model where we have to have a broad coalition. And my take on on how trade deals are totally messed up when it comes to clean energy and building your own companies and protecting workers in those new companies is that we shouldn't be trying to beat other countries for trying to put together the right kind of policies. We should be trying to join those countries. So the United States just picked off India for not only having a program that is trying to accelerate renewable energy, but also builds in local content standards so that local companies and local workers can benefit from it as well. Right? We need those same local content policies in our own country that couple our renewable energy and climate transition to an economy that also creates more jobs, right? And so if we had a better trading system, both India and the United States would be able to do this to create a low carbon and inclusive transition towards climate change. Instead, the U.S. is having very lackluster policies at home and trying to pick off other countries like India. And the U.S.-India suit is so bad because it essentially is going to subsidize coal in India. The United States is saying, hey, through the World Bank, we are not going to finance any coal in India. It's the cheapest thing in India, so that's what you would do under normal circumstances. We're saying, hey, we're not going to finance that. So India says, okay, we're going to create a renewable energy program, but we want to make sure that it creates jobs and builds our own companies here. And then the United States picks them off with the WTO. So we're killing jobs in India, we're hurting the climate, and we should actually be copying the kinds of policies that India and China have to try to not only build capacity for these new technologies and just think about emissions, but to use it as a broad-based way to grow their economy and to create jobs.
Thank you, Kevin. So I know we're over time, but let's just say it's my birthday too, and I'd like 1 minute to close. No, it's not. Truth in advertising. No, just since, again, we're at a university, and this is also about how we understand the world and can read it and act accordingly, I want to say one last note about this. We are facing a huge challenge with the climate crisis where we're having 100-year floods every 10 years. Think about that. What does a 100-year flood then mean? The scientific process is based on making observations, drawing rules, and then you have sort of a horizon of expectation and stability around those conclusions. And what we're discovering is that the time frame of that stability is getting shortened. That's where we are on planet Earth right now. On the other hand, we have all these rules which are all about giving corporations the ability to lock in low and lax regulations and hold them there over time, and the ability to sue governments that would then change those. I'll take an example. What do we know about fugitive methane emissions in the chain of natural gas production? We're learning more all the time. So if we lock in a standard today, right, and we discover something about it tomorrow, what is our ability to adapt? So these rules are in fact sort of the antithesis of that adaptability that says we're in a world that is changing at an accelerated rate, and we need our science and our understanding and our rules and our values to be able to adapt and change with it. And this may sound theoretical, but it's actually very, very practical, and it's the core of these agreements. So, okay, end of commercial. Sorry, thank you for your forbearance. Kevin, thank you very much for joining us with a very small carbon footprint. And thanks very much to Bill, wherever you are, and to Carol and Ilana for an excellent set of presentations. Thanks.